Welcome to all, dear students. In this lecture, I will let you to know about excess demand and what are the causes and consequences of excess demand. इसके क्या वजूहात हैं और इसके क्या नताइज होते हैं. What is excess demand? It is defined as when aggregate demand is greater than aggregate supply at full employment level. In simple words, in short, we can write it as the definition of excess demand is that at full employment level, when aggregate demand AD means aggregate demand is greater than aggregate supply. Shortly written as AS. This is a definition of excess demand. Excess demand is the situation that when aggregate demand is greater than aggregate supply corresponding to full employment level, when resources are fully utilized, when resources are fully employed, and when at that point aggregate demand exceeds aggregate supply, it is known as excess demand. The excess demand when aggregate demand is greater than aggregate supply at full employment level, when resources are fully utilized, when output cannot be increased, and there is only increase in aggregate demand and no increase in aggregate supply, and this leads to inflation. This we will explain in this lecture. This we will get in this lecture. But before that, I will explain this excess demand with the help of diagram. How it is shown with the help of diagram. हम इसको diagram के जरिए समझाएंगे. On vertical axis, or we can say on y-axis, we show the values of aggregate demand. AD means aggregate demand, and on horizontal axis, or we can say on x-axis, we write the values of income or output in terms of GDP, gross domestic product. These are synonymously used here because the GDP, that is the output of final goods and services, they are calculated in terms of monetary values, in terms of market values. When they are calculated in terms of monetary values, that means the income, because when there is production of goods and service means output means GDP, it generates income. Therefore we can use the term income or output in terms of GDP. And GDP, as you know, that it is the monetary value of all final goods and services which have been produced within domestic territory during an accounting year, during a given year time period. And this is the right angle, and we draw a 45-degree line which divided this plane, this area, into two equal parts. This is the 45-degree line showing that all points that lie on this 45-degree line, that there is equality between the values of income and aggregate demand. This line shows income denoted by Y is equal to expenditure, or we can write aggregate demand, because aggregate demand, it is a demand for all final goods and services in an economy during a given time period, and it is calculated in terms of money spent on all final goods and services, that is expenditure. Method is used which includes consumption, private consumption expenditure, investment expenditure, government expenditure, and expenditure on net export, that is the difference between the value of exports and imports. Therefore, in place of aggregate demand, we can also use the term expenditure. And all the points that lie on this 45-degree line show the equality between income and expenditure, or income and aggregate demand. This is the aggregate demand curve. AD is aggregate demand curve or aggregate demand line, and M shows more than full employment. When aggregate demand shown at more than full employment level, it is denoted by aggregate demand ADM, that is aggregate demand more than full employment. And this is the line, this is the curve showing aggregate demand at full employment. F means full employment and AD is aggregate demand at full employment. And this is the point of intersection, shows the equilibrium point, because it shows aggregate demand, that is expenditure, is equal to income. This is denoted by E, point E, this, and this shows the full employment level of full employment, that when resources are fully utilized. OQ shows full employment level of output, and this E1, this point lies on aggregate demand more than full employment, and we cannot produce level of output beyond OQ because resources are fully utilized, and this is the equilibrium point. There is no inflation, there is no excess demand, there is equality between aggregate demand and aggregate supply. Aggregate demand is this, aggregate supply is this much, there is equality, there is equilibrium. And if aggregate demand increases corresponding to this full employment level, there will be no increase in output, no increase in aggregate supply, and it will lead to excess of demand, that is aggregate demand will be greater than aggregate supply, and this will lead to increase in price, that is known as inflation. And this much is excess demand, E1, this much excess demand. E1 is excess demand. And this excess demand means when aggregate demand is greater than aggregate supply corresponding full employment level of resources, This excess demand, it leads to inflation. What is inflation? जिसको उर्दू में कहते हैं अफराती ज़र, which devalues the money, the purchasing power of money decreases, reduces. Inflation, it means it is defined as persistent or consistent rise in price level. That reduces the value of money, it devalues the currency, purchase power of money decreases due to inflation. इसकी डेफिनेशन है persistent rise in price. जब लगातार प्राइस में इंक्रीज होगा तो उसको हम कहते हैं इन्फ्लेशन, अफराती ज़र. And this is the inflationary gap, this area, this much. Inflationary gap. And why it happens? When aggregate demand increases and there is no increase in aggregate supply, this will lead to increase in price, because when demand increases, price will also increase, leading to inflation. For example, I will explain it with the help of this, that suppose given 10 kgs of flour, 10 kgs of flour, F-L-O-U-R, flour means atta, and this is the given resource, and for example labor is also given, and that is used to produce, for example, 100 breads. This OQ shows the given resource equal 10 kgs, which can produce the output equal to 100 breads, and when it is measured in monetary value, suppose the price of one bread is 5 rupees, it will be equal to 500 income. Therefore, we can use the term income or output, GDP, because this GDP, this output is converted into monetary values. And if the aggregate demand, this point shows equilibrium, this is the full employment level, it shows aggregate demand at full employment level of output. Aggregate demand at full employment level of output, suppose it is equal to 100 units. This much, 100 of bread, and aggregate supply AS, it is also equal to 100 units. There will be equilibrium. There will be no increase in price. There will be no inflation. But if aggregate demand more than full employment M, if it is equal to this much, this shows aggregate demand equal to 100. Aggregate supply is also equal to 100. If it is equal to 200 units, 200 units of bread, but aggregate supply is only OQ, that is equal to 100 units, means this is the aggregate supply equal to 100. This means aggregate demand is greater than aggregate supply. It is 200 and aggregate supply is only 100 units of bread, because resources are fully utilized. We have the only resources equal to 10 kgs of flour, because resources are limited, given. And when demand is more than supply, when aggregate demand is greater than aggregate supply, there is excess demand, it will lead to rise in price, that is inflation. And how much inflation is there? This will be shown by this gap, which is known as inflationary gap. What is inflationary gap? Inflationary gap, it is excess of aggregate demand it is excess. Excess means zyada. Excess of aggregate demand. I will use the symbol AD, aggregate demand. AD means aggregate demand. Over and above. Over and above it is level required to maintain full employment equilibrium in economy. Full employment equilibrium in economy. This is the definition of inflationary gap. It is the excess of aggregate demand. जब excess होगा aggregate demand में, aggregate demand ज़्यादा होगा aggregate supply से, जो ज़रूरी है full employment equilibrium maintain करने के लिए. And when there is excess of aggregate demand, it will lead to inflationary gap. मीन्स उससे ज़्यादा होगा ये aggregate demand as compared to aggregate supply, और जो gap होगा उसको हम कहते हैं inflationary gap. For example, this point shows aggregate demand more than full employment is only when we can produce 100 units of bread from the given resources, where resources are fully utilized. 100 kgs of flour are fully utilized to produce 100 units of bread, and aggregate demand is also equal to 100. There is equality, there is no inflation. But if we will take this point, this shows that aggregate demand is 200 and level of output should be equal to 200. Aggregate supply should be also equal to 200. Then there will be no inflation. But it is not so, because we have fully utilized the resource, such as 10 kgs of flour. We cannot produce beyond this point. We have the only 10 kgs of flour available. Which can be used to produce 100 breads. We cannot produce beyond this point because of this given resource, and it is full employment. It is fully utilized, fully used in the production of breads. Same example can be applied to the whole economy. In an economy there are different types of resources, and when all the resources are fully utilized, and beyond that there can be no increase in production, no increase in output, no increase in GDP, and there can be only increase in demand, aggregate demand, due to many factors such as increase in population, etc. And that will lead to shortage of goods, shortage of output. This will increase the price, and this persistent rise in price, persistent increase in price level is known as inflation. अफराती ज़र, which devalues the money, which reduces the value of money, purchasing the power of money. इससे खरीदने का ताकत जो मनी का होता है वो कम होता है. And I hope you have got all this basic concept of excess demand. Now we will proceed ahead to learn, to discuss about causes and consequences. इसके क्या वजूहात है और इसके क्या नताइज हो सकते हैं. Causes of excess demand. The first cause of increase in aggregate demand as compared to aggregate supply, that is excess demand, is increase in private consumption expenditure. These are the components of aggregate demand. Increase in private consumption expenditure. Where there is increase in consumption expenditure on food, clothes, cell phone, book, pen, and other food articles as compared to aggregate supply. This will lead to increase in expenditure known as private consumption expenditure. Second one is increase in investment expenditure. Increase in investment expenditure. Third cause is increase in government expenditure. Increase in government expenditure, such as expenditure on public goods, expenditure on roads, public parks, government education institutions, government health sector, defense, etc. This will also increase. This will also lead to excess demand and decrease increase in demand for net exports, or increase in value of net exports. That is difference between value of exports and imports. इससे भी excess demand होगी. And last one is decrease in tax rate. Decrease in tax rate. जब टैक्स रेट डिक्रीज होगा जो डिस्पोजेबल इनकम होगा इंडिविजुअल का वो इंक्रीज होगा, नेचुरली उसकी जो डिमांड होगी वो भी इंक्रीज होगी, एंड एज कंपेयर टू सप्लाई दिस विल लीड टू एक्सेस डिमांड. फॉर एग्जांपल, इफ इनकम is equal to 10,000, or we can say per annum income, that is annual income, is equal to 1 lakh, and tax rate is 10%. Therefore, 10% of 1 lakh will be equal to 10,000. This 10,000, it has to be paid towards the government, and nobody can deny to pay the tax, and the disposable income will be equal to 90,000 per annum. Suppose if tax rate is only 5%, 5% of 1 lakh, it will be equal to 5,000, and disposable income will be equal to 95,000. Therefore, demand will be more as at this level of income. Therefore, when there is decrease in tax rate, there will be increase in demand as compared to supply. Means when aggregate demand is more than aggregate supply at full employment level, there will be excess demand. The cause will be decrease in tax rate. It may be decrease in direct tax rate or decrease in indirect tax rate, such as decrease in GST, goods and services tax. Now what are its consequences? इसके जो नताइज है वो क्या हो सकते हैं? Consequences. Its consequences are increase in aggregate demand as compared to aggregate supply leads to demandful inflation. demand pull inflation. This is inflation due to excess demand when aggregate demand is greater than aggregate supply. उसको हम कहते हैं डिमांड पुल इन्फ्लेशन. इसी तरह when resources are in high demand due to excess aggregate demand, जब डिमांड ज़्यादा होगी प्रोडक्ट का, उसका प्रोडक्शन इंक्रीज करने के लिए, there will be increased demand for factors of production. This means increase in demand for resources due to increase in aggregate demand leads to increase in cost of production. That means cost push inflation. Cost push inflation. जब इन्फ्लेशन होगा, जब प्राइस लेवल इंक्रीज होगा ड्यू टू इंक्रीज इन कॉस्ट ऑफ प्रोडक्शन, एंड कॉस्ट ऑफ प्रोडक्शन तब इंक्रीज होगा जब डिमांड फॉर रिसोर्स इंक्रीज होगा, जब डिमांड फॉर फैक्टर्स ऑफ प्रोडक्शन सच एज लैंड, लेबर, कैपिटल एंड रॉ मटेरियल इंक्रीज होगा. और जो प्राइस लेवल इंक्रीज होगा उसको हम कहते हैं कॉस्ट पुश इन्फ्लेशन. इन्फ्लेशन ड्यू टू इंक्रीज इन कॉस्ट ऑफ प्रोडक्शन, जिसकी वजह से जो प्राइस ऑफ प्रोडक्ट होगा वो भी इंक्रीज होगा, और जो उसका जो प्राइस लेवल इंक्रीज हुआ है वो हुआ है ड्यू टू इंक्रीज इन कॉस्ट ऑफ प्रोडक्ट, जिसको हम कहते हैं कॉस्ट पुश इन्फ्लेशन. I hope you have got all these important points. Thanks.